Being able to use fresh hops in this short window, in this 6-week window, is super special until now. The beers that we make and the beers that most people make in this country and all over the world are IPAs. They're hop-forward beers, and it's the most important ingredient we use as far as a flavor and aroma profile. Brewing with fresh hops really, to me, creates a flavor profile that you can't create without actually using them. But the flavor impact, from unkilned hops, you are not getting very much bitterness. Brewing fresh hop beers is the favorite style of beer we like to make. One of the most important things about fresh hops is our connection to the valley. It's certainly a very personal thing for us, being 2.5 hours away from where the majority of hops are grown in the United States. If you're using fresh hops that were sitting in a truck for a couple days or got shipped across the country without any climate control, those things are already, kind of decaying by the time you're using them, and those will result in kind of more of these dank, earthy, vegetative flavors compared to something that is frozen, fresh. You get it into beer within a day or two, it's still gonna retain that brightness. So recipe considerations, as far as starting with your malt bill, treat it like any other beer that you'd be making on your system. As far as salts, we go anywhere from 1:1 to 2:1, calcium chloride to gypsum. Again, these are kind of just like the same beers that we're making without the fresh hops. You should be paying attention to pH. Using this much material is going to raise your pH, your wort pH, a little bit higher. So, the way that we combat that pH rise from this much plant material is through acidulated malt in our grain bill and through food-grade acids during our sparge and added to the wort in our whirlpool at knockout. Our pH range for our wort going into the fermenter is typically between 5.1 and 5.2. Planning for gravity drops. The water content is super high in these hops. We do see a slight drop in our original gravity at the end of using these hops. It tends to be about 0.2 to 0.8 Plato compared to your original recipe. A brewer like us, we don't necessarily care so much about what our starting gravity is, but if you're a brewer that really wants to nail a specific starting gravity, you can kind of factor that in, that you might lose around a half a Plato by the time you're knocking out. And again, that's kind of all dependent on how many pounds per barrel you're using of these fresh hops too. As far as designing your hop bill around using fresh hops, we do reduce our T90 pellets in the kettle. We still do add some T90 pellets in the kettle, and then we also still dry hop with pellets and cryo as well, since we're using these hops the majority on the hot side. Since every brew house is different, you are probably gonna need a couple more processed hoses packed in sanitizer. You might be making these weird connections, from the outlet of one vessel to the inlet of another vessel. So, have a pump nearby, have some hoses sanitized in the event that you need to kind of make yourself a new process pipe pathway to get this wort onto the hops, get the wort off the hops, and then get the hops out of your brew house too. We don't see anything different as far as biotransformation or dry hop creep goes when we're using these hops on the hot side. And as far as packaging consideration, to us, they are a lot more stable when you're using these hops on the hot side. We're a small brewery, we don't have a lab, and so knowing that these hops are unkilned, straight out of a field, it makes us feel better that we're hitting super hot wort prior to knocking out to the fermenter. We package them both in cans and draft. In the beers that we do use them on the cold side in small batches, in 2 to 3 barrel projects. For us to kind of feel comfortable with those, those are draft only, brewery only, so that we can kind of monitor the quality and maintain the level of standards that we have. My recommendation is really using them all on the hot side if you're concerned about the quality aspect of these beers out in the market.
Hot side. Fresh hop edition.
First edition, handful of hops while you're mashing in. Doesn't really do anything, but it gets you stoked to be brewing with fresh hops all day. It's ceremonial, and it should always be your first edition. Edition number 2, we do a bag of hops in our grant as we're running off from the mash tun to the kettle. Editions 3 and 4, sometimes 5, are additions to the boil kettle towards the end of the boil. Edition 5 or 6 is a bag into the whirlpool. Edition 7 or 8 is the big granddaddy of them all edition, which is the bulk of your fresh hops. Anywhere from 80 to 90% of all the fresh hops you bought are going into our mash tun as a converted massive hop back. So we're cleaning the mash tun out as best we can. We'll remove some screens. We'll make sure all that crud and grain is out of the mash tun. We'll cold rinse it. We'll cool it down. We'll then add all of those hops on top of our mash tun screens. And then post-boil or post-whirlpool, we'll transfer that wort onto the mash tun through the bottom, recircuit the entire time. So now we're talking contact time. So we want all of that wort mixing with all of those hops. It's kind of a natural way to filter your wort, so you can feel free to bypass the whirlpool. We do that the majority of the time because recirculating over a massive bed of hops is a fantastic way to filter and clarify your wort. After about 30 to 45 minutes total of your wort being recirculated through your mash tun hop back, we then knock out from our mash tun through our heat exchanger and then into our fermenter. Since we have a grant, we hit the wort one last time as our 8th or 9th edition now from the grant. So wort's coming out of the mash tun hop back into the grant, knocking out from the grant. Our general philosophy is have the wort touch the hops as many points and places as possible. All these hops on all the wort as much as possible within reason. We use hop sacks. Put those cones in a hop sack, tie it tight. That way you don't have hops circulating throughout your process piping, maybe getting clogged at a butterfly valve, or heaven forbid in your heat exchanger. You guys all know how much it sucks to have a clogged heat exchanger, so don't do that to yourself. Another consideration when you're adding hops to the kettle in the whirlpool, we use like unbleached cotton rope to tie our sacks somewhere from the outside of our boil kettle and whirlpool. When you're emptying these vessels, these hop sacks are easy to pull out of the vessels. An area of concern also is watching the temperature of your wort. We don't sanitize our mash tun when we're doing this. It's just kind of a hard thing to do and logistically doesn't necessarily make sense for us. So because of that, we're making sure that our wort temperature is always above pasteurization temperature, which is 165. Our mash tun's well insulated, so that kind of allows us to stay above that contamination level prior to knocking out. If you are using hops on the cold side, the end quality of the product, there's just a lot more unknown variables when you're adding anything on the cold side of your beer. Another thing to consider is like communicating like how special and unique this process is to your front of house staff and then to your customers. It's a cool thing that you're doing, and if you're really into it and you're super enthusiastic about it, that bleeds into the other people around you, like at your brewery, and the people that are drinking at your brewery too. So it's super f***ing cool and unique, and that's kind of one of those things that is infectious. So keep that in mind, like let people know how special this is, and then they'll in turn get excited about it too.